Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Israel Matters. I hope you had a wonderful weekend. Once again, I'm Rabbi Pesach Wolicki, and I'm here with my dear friend, Elliot Chodoff. How you doing, Elliot?
I'm good. Good way to start the week.
Yeah, so today is the 7th of the month of Cheshvan, the second month of the year, meaning the second month after Rosh Hashanah. And today is a significant day on the calendar. Maybe a lot of our viewers aren't aware, but what's significant about it is that today is the day that we start asking for rain. We mention rain starting on Sukkot.
In the land of Israel.
Yeah, in the land of Israel, we start asking for rain in our 3 times a day daily prayers. And the reason that there's a delay, I just want to share an interesting note to people, because many people might be aware that we started officially talking about rain in our prayers, although not as a request, but praising God for rain, starting on Feast of Tabernacles on Sukkot. We hold off on actually formally requesting rain, asking God for rain for 2 weeks from Sukkot until now, until the 7th of Cheshvan. The historical reason behind that is that the pilgrims who would come to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles would then, of course, have to travel home. And because the travel was done on donkey and on foot, and there were some people who lived in some fairly distant areas, and in Second Temple times, there were even a significant number of pilgrims who came from Babylonia, who would, although they didn't move to Israel as they should have, they still came for the holidays. They made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, just like nowadays in a non-coronavirus year, so many Jews from abroad fly to Israel for the holidays. So they would give them a couple weeks to get home, because if it started raining in this region, if it started raining in the land of Israel in the days immediately following Sukkot, it would make the roads difficult for travel. So that's the reason for the delay, and we still keep it to this day, that we hold off on asking for rain. So I just want to share with everyone that in your prayers for Israel, as you continue to pray for us, please include prayers for rain. Israel is a land that depends on rainfall. Last year, we had the rainiest winter in many, many years and decades, maybe in Israel's history. I don't remember the exact numbers, but last year's rainfall was crazy, and it was great, and it was wonderful for the country. And we're hoping that we have another good rainfall. Let's get into the news. We are going to get back to the Russia issue today, but before we do that, big news story relating to Israel is another peace deal in the area, this time with Sudan. Now, my initial reaction when I first heard, oh, Sudan, yay, another Arab country making peace with Israel. What I want to ask you, Elliot, is when we think about Sudan and its history, as opposed to Bahrain and the Emirates, who were part of the Arab countries and part of the Arab League, and therefore they were part of the Arab boycott of Israel and the general Arab attitude, they were never really open and active enemies and adversaries of Israel. Sudan is a different animal. This is a country that has been historically a bitter enemy of Israel and a center for terrorism. And in fact, right now, as I understand it, they have a military leadership in the country, and the last elected, whatever democracy they have, the last elected leader, and still a lot of the political culture there is very anti-Israel. So how is this peace deal similar? How is it different? And is it stable based on these factors?
Well, let me start with the last one. It's certainly not stable in a country that's inherently unstable.
Meaning in comparison to the Emirates and Bahrain, where we could rely on that.
Right. Look, you know what? Let's for a moment reflect on Egypt after the fall of Mubarak, when Morsi came into office, and Egypt is a stable country by Middle Eastern standards. But here, all of a sudden, we had a Muslim Brotherhood government for a short period until the Sisi takeover, and we were worried about the peace treaty with Egypt. If the Brotherhood had stayed in power, consolidated their power, they might have taken Egypt off in an entirely different direction. So Sudan, which is notoriously unstable, and especially now, it is a military rule without necessarily strong institutional support. The military in Sudan is not the military in Egypt. The Egyptian military is very, very much part of the Egyptian government and institutional sort of core base.
Apparatus, yeah.
So, a country like Sudan can flip back just as it flipped this way. This, where it is today, is an aberration, and maybe that's the really big contrast. If we look at if we look at the peace treaties that we have, or the relationship treaties that we have, Egypt was, of course, the frontline enemy of Israel, and one of the things that brought Egypt to the table ultimately was the defeat. They can call it whatever they want, but the defeat in the Yom Kippur War. And Sadat, and once again, many reasons, but one was Sadat saying, you know what, it isn't going to get any better than it got on Yom Kippur afternoon, October 6th. We caught them completely by surprise, completely out, and a military that was not up to the par that should have been even surprised. And we still lost. The war still ended with the Israeli army 101 kilometers from Cairo. So maybe this isn't a really good policy to follow when I've got all this other stuff that I need to deal with, like an economy and unrest in the country and so on and so forth. So that was an internal Egyptian decision based on direct interests in an active conflict.
Yeah, and not to mention, maybe I could get my land back if I make a deal.
Okay, right. That's part of that was part of the incentive to making the deal. But I'm talking about just the idea of making peace.
Right.
Okay. The Jordanian deal was really a minor, very important, but minor in the sense that once Hussein decided to do it, it was a signing. There was negotiation. We gave them water. There was territorial handover that we had, but it was. We're not talking about huge swaths of territory, not Sinai. The Gulf states, really, as you said, they've been nominally part of the conflict, but we had no territorial issues between us, no real ideological issues. They were sort of hangers-on to the conflict. And of course, identifying more strongly with the Arab League than with us, they were there, they went along, and that sort of thing. So even though it's very important, we've discussed how important it is, there's nothing sort of radical in what they did. It was the sort of step-by-step, and Israelis have been talking about this for at least 5 or 6 years, that we'll be able to cultivate them. Good that it happened now. Credit to those who did it. I don't believe, it doesn't matter what your politics are. Credit to the ones who were involved in closing the deal. I'm talking about the Trump and the Netanyahu administrations.
Yeah, and this also affects the population, the grassroots level, meaning people in the street in Bahrain and in the Emirates weren't seething with hatred for Israel.
Exactly.
They weren't part of that.
Correct.
Whereas in Sudan, we have a different situation.
Now, Sudan is a whole different story. Let's start with the fact that this is a shift, diametric shift, from the 3 no's to yes.
Explain what the 3 no's are to people who don't
know.
Right.
For those who are not familiar, immediately after the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel made an offer to the Arabs. So look, we just took all this territory, which we did not intend to take. I don't know how many people are aware of that. There was only one geographical objective given to the IDF of the Six-Day War, and that was the old city of Jerusalem. That was the only place where the army was told, take this piece of real estate. On all the other fronts, the army was told, defeat the enemy, go into his territory and defeat him. But the mission was not to take territory. Okay, it was a consequence. So when the war ended, in all of the optimism and euphoria of the end of the war, the Israeli leadership said, great, now we can make peace. We'll give you all your territory back, except for Jerusalem, and we'll make peace, and it's over. And by the way, the idea of land for peace comes from that offer of 1967. That was in June. In August of 1967, the Arab League met in Khartoum in Sudan and responded officially to the Israeli offer with what is known historically as the 3 no's. No peace, no recognition, no negotiations. Pretty clear.
So that happened in Sudan.
In Sudan, in Khartoum, right. Exactly. Okay. Now, I mean, it was a rotational thing, but they were part of this. And just to continue the story briefly, just to close it, a few months later, the United Nations Security Council embodied the Israeli offer in what is known as Security Council Resolution 242, which calls for withdrawal from territories and all the states in the region having secure and recognized borders. Okay, so essentially UN Security Council 242 is the Israeli offer of 1967, okay, which they turned down, rejected outright, no, no, no. And now Khartoum is saying yes. So in and of itself, this is just, even if only on a symbolic level, we're talking about a huge, huge shift from one to the other. But it's more than symbolic. Sudan was active. They sent troops in '73 to Egypt. They were always implacable. They had a radical Islamist government for many, many years. Al-Qaeda was heavily active there, based there, welcomed there over the years. It went through a serious civil war, but always with the from the perspective of a fiercely radical Islamic leadership. So the break here is shattering. Sudan, the joke was always Jordan, and turned out to be true. Jordan is going to be the second country to make peace with Israel. We don't know who the first is, but Jordan will be second.
So why did this happen then? If this is Sudan,
okay,
why are they next?
Okay, so the joke, had it continued, would have been Sudan is going to be the last country to make peace with Israel. Okay, we don't know who else, but they're going to be the last. So again, we have a change in government as number one. Number two, the Americans took a very, very active role in this. They negotiated a first step, which was that Sudan agreed without prejudice to pay over $300 million in damages to Americans who were harmed by terrorism that came out of Sudan.
Wow.
And without prejudice, meaning they deny that they're responsible, but as a goodwill gesture, they will pay the money. In return, America took them off the terrorism list. And the next step after that was the deal with Israel. In other words, this was a linked step-by-step process. So here America had a huge influence on it and tied the three together in linkage.
Okay, so let me maybe I'm paraphrasing, or maybe I'm interpreting. Let me make sense of what you just said. To put it simply, Sudan wants to be part of the American camp on the global stage.
Correct.
And the price of admission is resolving the terrorism issue, which includes this goodwill gesture.
Right.
And the quid pro quo, the US removes them from the terrorist list. And the Trump administration made part of the price of admission a recognition of Israel and a normalization there.
Apparently.
Okay.
If I had to put money on it, I would put money on it. But there's linkage for sure. In other words, they were talking with Israel, but it was clear that if they said outright, if we're not off the terrorism list, we're not making a deal. So it was there. Was it an absolute quid pro quo, step by step? Probably, but it doesn't really matter that much. It was all part of that package together. And America has its own interests in it, and that'll bring us shortly to the whole Russian story.
Okay.
But let's keep in mind also that for Sudan, remaining an enemy of Israel, as for many of these countries, once Egypt was out of the picture, was largely symbolic. Sudan had no real means on its own to engage in in warfare with Israel. And like I said, with powerful Egypt out of the picture, they were just sort of hanging out there. They were also much more ideological, as I said before, but in practical terms, they were out in nowhere's land. too far away from Israel to have any real effect, and too weak. Okay, Iran is far away, but it's strong. Too weak to have any effect on its own. But the symbolism is important, especially, as I said, when you're talking about an implacable Islamist enemy that was supporting Al Qaeda. Bin Laden was operating out of Sudan for a while. So,
is it safe to say here also that, look, Israel gains from any Muslim country, any Arab country that normalizes, that breaks up the, further aids the ongoing disintegration of the United Arab Front against Israel is good.
Correct.
But as opposed to the Gulf states, where there's a serious economic cooperation on the horizon, that Israel can look at the Gulf states and say, okay, wow, like we could do great things together. That's not there really with Sudan. Sudan is at this point, has this military government over in a fairly war-torn area, and a lot of, it's not in the economic league as the Gulf states. So
Correct.
from Israel's perspective, there's a lot less, on the horizon to gain from this partnership.
Correct. Again, there's a lot of symbolism here, and we'll probably end up putting more into them than they put into us in terms of aid and assistance of all types and advisors and that sort of thing. But let's also keep in mind that this is Africa. There's a geographical element here, because while Libya doesn't really exist in order to make decisions, we do have Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, Morocco in particular, but the others who are also in some form or another, especially Tunisia and Morocco, have had some form of relationship, in part through the idea that Jews fled from those countries and they still have certain links and that sort of thing. So having moved it onto the African side, and certainly a country like Sudan, it could open up other countries as well. There's a certain domino effect here that's very, very hard to predict. But you can see, for example, a Moroccan government saying, you know what, we're not impressed with the Emirates, we're not impressed with Bahrain. They're a bunch of sheikhs sitting off in the desert pumping oil. Sudan changes that whole mosaic, and that could have very high impact.
Okay, so what does this have to do with Russia? You said before that this takes us back to the Russian thing.
There's another aspect on this that's also very important. The Russians moved into Syria, as we spoke, that the last time we spoke about Russia, for their own specific strategic reasons of the coast and the ports and that sort of thing. But there's another element to this as well. Putin wants Russia back in the game, not just militarily, but also politically. I mean, strategy is not just military strategy, it's political strategy, it's positioning, it's allies, it's denying allies to your adversary. Now, on that level, very complex. And the world is a much more complex world today than it has been, or it had been, post-World War II during the Cold War. The Cold War was a very simple world. Don't confuse simple with secure, but simple in the sense that there was the Warsaw Pact, there was NATO, there were the non-aligned nations, and that was it. And countries didn't shift. You were either in this one or you were in that one. And if you were in one, you didn't have a lot to do with the other. Maybe a little on the periphery. For most of history, diplomacy was far more complex than that. Friends came and went, enemies came and went. Yesterday's enemy was today's friend, and tomorrow's enemy again. Setting up solid bases of support became much more important. Deals came and went. Let's not forget that in August 1939, Stalin and Hitler signed a non-aggression pact. I mean, you can think of two more diametrically opposed ideological systems that were greater enemies. I can't, but they did. They carved up Poland between them, and it held until June 1941 when the Germans invaded Russia. summarily ending that pact. What's 162 division invasion between friends?
Sure.
Okay. Now,
hey, it lasted 2 years.
Russia is playing it. Hey, right. They were they were a good 2 years. America under first Bush Jr., but more importantly under Obama, expressed their disinterest in the Middle East. And don't let the Iraqi story get in the way of that. The American Iraqi story. That had something that was not the Middle East. That was a feeble attempt at an experiment to see if democracy will spontaneously generate in the sands. And it failed. But all in all, America was pulling out. Russia moved into the vacuum when it was ready. And it was ready during the Syrian civil war. America sat and watched it happen, and Russia moved into position. It did it making all sorts of arrangements with Turkey, with Iran, and tacitly with Israel as well. Because one of the things that's important for us to remember is that Putin's Russia is not Soviet Russia. It's operating in a much colder, calculating fashion than the Soviets. Okay, there's no way the Soviets could make any sort of tacit arrangement with Israel because Israel was in the American camp. Here, Israel is in the American camp, but that doesn't stop Russia from coming to arrangements that suit its purpose in the region. And it was gaining influence because America had left the field and Russia was now the country to go to. Incidentally, when Assisi took over in Egypt, the Obama administration cut Egypt off. Now, Egypt had shifted from the Soviet to the American orbit in the 1970s. By the way, the only major country to voluntarily shift from one side to the other during the Cold War.
Wow, the only one.
Yeah. Tremendous loss for the Russians, strategically, in terms of naval bases in Alexandria, support. I mean, Egypt's a key country. And America worked very hard to keep Egypt in the fold. The Obama administration says to Assisi, you're not legitimate. It was a military coup. We only support democratically elected governments, which is not true. We're cutting you off. We're holding up all arms transfers to you. And the Russians moved and said, we'll give you arms. We'll sell you arms. We have no problem. And it was very touch and go there for a little while. That Egypt could very well have shifted over back to the Russians. America got its act together and it didn't happen. So Russia's operating in other places and playing everybody else off against each other. In other words, they want Iran to do some of their dirty work, but not too much. They want Turkey to do some of their dirty work, but not too much. Turkey and Russia are traditional enemies. So there's a lot of balancing there. Now, all of a sudden, and here's the key point, it's a long way around to it. The Americans are moving back in, and they're not moving in militarily. It's worse.
Collecting countries.
Yeah, they're moving
countries.
Right, they're gaining power. They're gaining influence. Much more dangerous to the Russians than American military presence.
So when Trump gets elected and he makes his first trip to the Middle East, he visits Saudi Arabia, Egypt, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Israel.
Right.
So that's when he starts this process of engaging these nations.
Right.
And now he's got like, his hand, he's got the UAE, he's got Bahrain, and he's using Israel, or he's connecting them to Israel and creating a coalition of allies. So Sudan is now, I guess, officially with this deal, part of that.
That's right. They're tied in.
Part of that group. Wow.
And the Russians would do anything in their power within political reason to try to shake this up and break it up.
And we could expect that they will.
Without a doubt, without a doubt.
So that gives us something to look towards, actually, as things continue to play out. In other words, because the Russians are not, they don't just do things diplomatically. They could try to foment unrest in the street, try to affect the political processes in these countries.
I'll give you an example. There are American politicians, and we don't talk American politics here much, and we're not going to today either, but Democratic Party lawmakers who are threatening to cut off Saudi Arabia because of its human rights issues. Now, I'm not a great fan of Saudi Arabian human rights, but they're basically saying, we're going to leave you exposed to Iran, to the Houthis in Yemen. You're misusing weapons against the Houthis. Civilians are getting killed, so we're going to cut off your weapons. And I sit there and say, well, you know what? No, it doesn't work that way. This is still better than what would have been, or what would be if Iran moves in there. And you're not playing in a perfect world where you can dictate these sorts of things.
I mean, not to mention the duplicity of the fact that those same Democrat lawmakers are happy to embrace, other non-democratically functioning nations.
You mean like Iran?
Like Iran chief of them, but there's many. I mean, there's many examples. Sure.
But my point is that's a place where Russia could make trouble in order to get America, if it's misguided about it, to go in another direction and shake things up. The only good news in all of this, if you will, from our perspective vis-a-vis the Russians, is the Russians, even though Putin is thinking strategically, he does not apparently yet have a cohesive grand strategy in this region. And part of it may be because of the so much instability that he doesn't want to put too many of his eggs in one basket.
I would imagine he also has less to offer these nations.
Correct. Look, he doesn't have money. His economy is not in great shape. He's operating beyond his economic capability.
So he can't provide the type of foreign aid
that
the U.S. can provide.
No. So that's what we're watching at the moment. There's this maneuver going on, and the fact is that the Americans are outmaneuvering the Russians at the moment. The Russians' locus of maneuver is Syria, and America's operating all around.
Wow. All right, Elliot, this is great. So to sum things up, when we look at the Sudan peace deal, while at the same time we're happy about it, the same way we were happy about all the peace deals, and it's a nice step forward, it's positive. It's positive with an asterisk, maybe, in comparison to Bahrain and UAE, where we're like, okay, this is an interesting move on the chessboard. It's not necessarily as stable a move, and we now know what we have to look for going forward. Like, what does it do? So that's a great explanation, and I can only think that it. Probably Egypt is happy about it because they're on that continent.
Egypt is thrilled. I'm sure they're thrilled.
Because they a more stable Sudan that's under the watchful eye of the Americans is a benefit to the Egyptians.
Right. Let's also remember, this is a whole subject in of itself. I'm just going to throw it out there because we don't have time to go there. The Nile starts in Sudan.
Very interesting.
The Egyptians have a lot of interest in what's happening to their south.
Yeah, maybe a topic we could explore at some point is U.S. policy on the African continent, because it's something that is that has impact on Israel.
We can get there.
I think that'll do it for today.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for watching. Please share. Please spread the word. Please tell people about this. Everyone who watches this knows that there's a depth of insight and a depth of analysis that Elliot provides that you get here on Israel Matters that you're just not getting anywhere else. So please spread the word and continue with the feedback. We love it, and we get great ideas about what to talk about. And of course, keep praying for Israel. God bless.